Hello BookTube. Today I'm talking about The History of Rome, Volume 1, The Republic, by Mike Duncan. I've talked about Mike Duncan a lot on this channel before. I've reviewed his podcasts and I've reviewed his books, and I'll leave a link in the description down below to a playlist of all the stuff by him I've reviewed before. But he first got his start with the History of Rome podcast, which is, well, I guess all podcasts are for niche audiences, aren't they? Among history buffs, the History of Rome is a very famous podcast. If you're not interested in Roman history, possibly you've never heard of that podcast. This book is the transcript of the History of Rome podcast in book form. And it's probably only of interest to people who are fans of the History of Rome podcast or who are interested in the History of Rome podcast. So if that's not you, this review is not going to be interesting to you. Sorry about that. I'll catch you on the next video. But if you are interested in the History of Rome podcast, then this is an interesting little book. I have to admit, I'm very confused about its existence, and maybe somebody out there watching this video knows more about this book than I do and can help answer some of these questions. I don't know. But if memory serves, I first heard about this book while I was on Amazon looking for Mike Duncan's other books on Amazon. So he's got two professionally published books, Storm Before the Storm and Hero of Two Worlds, both of which I've talked about before on this channel. But this book is published by an independent press, Herodotus Press, and what confuses me is that I've never heard Mike Duncan talk about this book anywhere. So his other two books, if you listen to Mike Duncan's podcast, you know. His other two books he's plugged relentlessly on his podcast. And I don't begrudge him for that. That's what authors have to do, is they have to self-promote. But he's never mentioned this book on his podcast. So once I found out that this book existed, I tried to figure out, why did he publish it? Has he said anything publicly about it? I can't find anything. Now, I don't know. Maybe somebody who's been a Mike Duncan fan for longer than I have been will know more of the backstory behind this book. But yeah, I mean, all sorts of questions arise. First of all, why has Mike Duncan never promoted this book anywhere? Is he not happy with it? Is he ashamed of it? Secondly, why it says Volume 1, The Republic, and indeed the book only goes up to the assassination of Julius Caesar, and that's where it stops. So that implies that there would be a Volume 2 coming out, because Mike Duncan covered the whole of the Roman Empire, all the way up to the fall of Rome. So there's plenty more material in the podcast to do a Volume 2. Why did a Volume 2 never come out? All sorts of questions. Somebody let me know in the comments if you know anything about the history of this book. And apparently it's also out of print. So that's another question. Why is it out of print? Now, because it's out of print, it looks like, the last time I checked it on Amazon, people are selling it for an extraordinary amount of money, like, $100 or $200. I don't remember, for this book, which in my opinion is absolutely not worth that money. So I wouldn't recommend buying it off of Amazon, even though I leave a Amazon link in the description down below like I always do. But I got this from my library, through interlibrary loan, actually. I was curious about it. I thought, I wonder if I could track down this book somewhere in the Michigan library system. And sure enough, one library in Michigan had it. So I was able to order it on interlibrary loan, and here it is, The History of Rome in book form. If you can get it from your local library, go ahead. I wouldn't pay $100 or more for it on Amazon, but if, of course, you be the judge of that. So, before I got this, I was wondering if this book had been published without Mike Duncan's consent. And maybe that was the reason why Mike Duncan never talked about it. But there's actually an introduction by Mike Duncan in which he talks about publishing this book. Can you see that there, Mike Duncan, 2015? So he was on board with this at one time. And as he says in the introduction, he is pretty much keeping the original transcripts as they were originally written, even though he's a much better writer now. There's a temptation to rewrite it. But he says, I'm going to resist that temptation. And anytime there's an error, he fixes the error. But other than that, this is pretty much just the transcripts as they were originally on the History of Rome show. So, it's, it is what it is, isn't it? If you listen to Mike Duncan, you know that he has definitely improved in his craft since he began. So the early episodes of the History of Rome were, they were okay. They were listenable. They were interesting, but they weren't brilliant. As Mike Duncan has progressed, he has gotten better and better. So his most recent podcasts, I think, are really something fantastic. The History of Rome is his early material. But the History of Rome, even the History of Rome got better as it went on. So this is not Mike Duncan's best work, but for History of Rome completists, you might be interested to read the book. One of the reasons I wanted to read the book is because I am aware that when I listen to a podcast, sometimes I don't absorb everything. Even when I listen to it multiple times, as I did the History of Rome, I have it on in the background. My attention is tuning in and out. I'll tune in for parts, and then I'll get, I'll be thinking about something else for parts. And I knew I was doing that, but nonetheless, it was eye-opening for me, at least, to sit down and read it as a book and realize how different my interaction with that information was. So when I sat down and read it as a book, I felt like I was absorbing it slowly and carefully, and I was really getting in all the details. And as I was reading through that, there were many times when I thought, I don't think I fully appreciated this picture when I was listening to it. But now that I'm reading it, I'm getting all the solid details. And a lot of those, at least for me, those kind of details were a lot of things about geography or troop movements. When I was listening into a podcast, I was just thinking, okay, the troops are somewhere, but I wasn't really visualizing where these cities were. When I was reading this, I was able to clue into all the geographic details. There are some maps included in this book, some of Mike Duncan's hand-drawn maps, like this over here, for example, or... Sorry, let me find another one. There are a few throughout this book. Here's another example, which I am guessing maybe originally came from the website. So Mike Duncan would occasionally draw maps, which he would post on his website. But one of the interesting things about Mike Duncan's websites are they're such a mess. He really doesn't seem to give much thought to preserving his websites as archives of his work. Even though on his podcast he'll frequently on his podcast he will frequently reference maps or additional material that he's put up on his website. But his website is just really hard to navigate if you're not, at the time that they were posted, they were right up on the front page of his website. But because other material has gotten posted on the front page ahead of that, unless you just kind of go through and click through all his archives, it's really hard to find stuff that he references in his podcast, like maps and stuff like that. So I guess that's one advantage of getting this in book form, is you can get the maps in here. There's not a lot of maps, but there's a few maps. So that's what was interesting for me, is just having a different opportunity to process the same information. Now, your mileage on this may vary. If you are somebody who feels like when you listen to a podcast, you are 100% locked into it and you are getting all the details and stuff like that, then maybe having it also in book form would be less useful to you. But it was interesting for me to really have a chance to kind of fully absorb the information in book form that I had just been casually absorbing in podcast form. Now, the obvious advantage of a podcast is that you can listen to it while you're doing other things. So you're not sacrificing time on it per se. Maybe there's another better podcast you could be listening to, but it's all just kind of free time. It's time that you're already spent doing something else, that you've got the podcast going on. At least I think that's true for most people. When you're reading a book, though, that is time you are specifically setting out of your day to read the book. So that's a big difference between a podcast and a book. And it does make you wonder if there might be a better book that you could be spending your time on. And this is maybe where this suffers a little bit as a book, especially with something like the history of Rome. I mean, how many books have been written on the history of Rome, right? Even just within the last century, there have got to have been hundreds of books. So you're thinking to yourself, especially these early chapters, which, like I said, aren't particularly well written. I mean, they're okay, but they're not brilliant. As you're reading this to yourself, you're thinking, I wonder if actually this time would have been better spent reading a different book on the history of the Roman Republic. Something that was, a little bit more eloquently written, something that got into a little bit more interesting details, something that had better maps on it. And so in that respect, you got to wonder if this book is really worth spending your time on. I guess if you're a Mike Duncan completionist, you're going to want to read this book. But for other people, maybe there would be a better book on the Roman Republic, the history of the Roman Republic, that they would like to read. The book has 46 chapters. The last chapter is Sic Semper Tyrannis, the assassination of Julius Caesar. I know there's a good case to be made for saying that the Republic didn't end until Augustus Caesar or even Tiberius Caesar. But we're ending here with the assassination of Julius Caesar. Each chapter corresponds to an episode on the History of Rome podcast. And the title of the chapters match the title of the History of Rome podcast. Even when Mike Duncan does a special episode, which is a history of Rome Christmas, which is episode number 18 on the podcast and chapter number 18 in the book. It's included here. Although in this part, the history of Rome Christmas is the only special episode. So that's the only break in the narrative for this section. Some of the chapters are longer than others. For example, chapter 23, the war with Hannibal, is much longer than the other chapters. But then I went back and I double-checked this on the podcast. And that's because in the original podcast, Mike Duncan had labeled, I think it was 4 different episodes, all episode 23. So there's 23A, 23B, 23C, 23D, but they were all 23 in the labels of the podcast episode. And so he condenses all of those into chapter 23 here. And there's a few other chapters that are like that, chapters that were broken into different parts in the podcasts. The Gallic Wars was one, Marius was one, I think the First Punic War was another one. There are a few more like that, which account for the varying length of chapters. Yeah, what else to say here, huh? An index would have been nice, especially in the early part of the book, when it was a lot of unfamiliar names to me. Like when we get into the Gracchi brothers going forwards. The Gracchi brothers on is a part of Roman history I'm very familiar with, so I know all the names there. But the early part of the Republic, I'm not so familiar with those names. So when Mike Duncan says, so-and-so was a son of so-and-so, who we met back in the earlier chapters, I was like, oh, who was that again? And I would sometimes go back and try and find it, but it's always difficult hunting for a name. I would have liked to have an index on here, but I know I'm wishing for unicorns, because this is a book published by an independent publisher. There's no team of staff going through and creating an index and matching all the names to pages and stuff like that. I mean, that's a lot of work for an independent press to create an index, wouldn't it? So, no index, I can understand it. There is at least, there's a few typos in the book. Again, an independent press, I can understand it. There's, I think, at least one case where a name is messed up, and it's during the Samnite War period. Mike Duncan is referring to a person, I don't remember who it is, but if you read the book, you'll catch this. He's giving the guys, he's saying, this is the same guy we encountered earlier, who did this in a previous chapter, and I went back and I looked, and it was a different name in the earlier chapters. So either the name in the earlier chapters was wrong or the name in the later chapters was wrong. I'm not sure if this is a mistake that, or who knows, maybe the guy had 2 names in history. But either way, I'm still counting it as a mistake, because even if the guy did have 2 names, then the author should make it clear, by the way, this guy had 2 names. The author should still explain that there are 2 names. But I think it's just a mistake. I'm not sure if this was a mistake that was in the transcript of the original History of Rome podcast. I did go back to the History of Rome podcast and try and to re-listen to some of those episodes to try and match them up with the book a little bit. But since Mike Duncan has reconfigured his old podcasts to make them more ad-friendly, there's so many ads in them that it's difficult to get through. The ads are automated now. So you have to listen to like 2 ads at the beginning just to get into the original podcast. And I figure, oh, okay, fine, whatever. But then when I want to kind of skip to the middle to try and find a specific spot that matches up with the pages of this book, Then every time you skip to the middle of the podcast, then you have to listen to ads again, just as a penalty for skipping ahead. So because the History of Rome podcast has gotten a lot more ad heavy than it was back in its original day, I've not done a lot of the work of comparing this to the original podcast, but I'm assuming it's the same. Mike Duncan said in the introduction that it's pretty much the same. He cut out the recap part at the beginning of each episode, as he makes clear in his introduction to this book, and a few other things that don't translate to print well, he smoothed over. When there were mistakes, of course, he fixed those. And sometimes there'll be a footnote at the bottom. Like originally in the podcast, it said this, thanks to so-and-so for pointing out the mistake. Let me see if I can find an example of that real quick. I don't have it bookmarked, but... Okay, I'm not saying it now, but you'll have to trust me on this. It's in there. And that's really all I have to say about this book. I mean, to a certain extent, this doesn't really need a review, although I know I've been yammering on for 20 minutes now. But it's basically just what you would expect. It's the History of Rome podcast as a book. It's the transcripts of the History of Rome podcast just as a book. And exactly why Mike Duncan has seemed to be ignoring this book, or why it seems to be erased from Mike Duncan's history, that's a real interesting question for me. But yeah, the book itself is... Yeah. If you've listened to the podcast already, you pretty much know exactly what to expect. So find it at your local library if you can. Maybe get it through interlibrary loan like I did. I wouldn't recommend paying the exorbitant prices that Amazon is currently charging for the few remaining copies that are in circulation. I will say this. I'll make a couple more comments. This took me a while to get through. There's 476 pages in here. It took me just a little bit over a month to read through. I'm a slow reader. With the beginning of school starting, I've been very busy with the new school year, etc. So, keep those caveats in mind. But this did keep me busy for a while, for better or for worse. I would totally be up for buying at a reasonable price other books like this. I'm not going to pay like over $100 for this, but if Mike Duncan or his publishing agent wanted to publish the History of Rome Volume 2, I would buy that and read that. If they wanted to publish the Revolutions transcripts as a book, I would totally be up for those. I mean, that is where Mike Duncan really hits his peak as a storyteller. And some of those, I would be very happy to take another pass at in written form. I don't think, based on the fact that this book seems to be swept under the rug, I don't think there are any plans for that. But I'd be up for that if that were to happen. But until that day, here we have the History of Rome Volume 1, the Republic, no Volume 2.